Join with me in prayer. May the words of my mouth and the meditations in our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Fake news. There's all kinds of fake news around, or at least we're told there's all kinds of fake news around, to the point where you don't know what to believe. Is there a God? Is God dead? Does science, that is the observation of what's going on around us, produce facts? And will those facts settle all the answers to all of our questions? Is there room in our hearts for wisdom? Moses, in the Old Testament story from Exodus, was hiding out. We know the story of Moses. He was hiding out. He was in Midian. He was taking care of sheep in his father-in-law Jethro's herd. One day, Moses was taking the sheep beyond the normal pastures and went out to the Mount of God. And there he saw, as he was taking care of the sheep, a burning bush. Remember the story? The bush was burning. An angel had set it on fire, but it wasn't consumed. And Moses said, I must turn aside. I must find out what this bush is all about that burns and isn't consumed. And when God saw that Moses had turned aside, God spoke to Moses. Moses, Moses, he said. And Moses said, here am I. Notice the word order. Here am I. A mirror image. Here am I. And God said, take your sandals off, for you are standing on holy ground. And Moses then heard God say, I want to send you back to Egypt. And Moses said to God another time, who am I? Notice the word order. Who am I that you would send me back to Egypt? And besides that, God, I have some unfinished business back in Egypt that could make it very difficult for me were I to go back. So Moses, like most of us, especially I think when we don't want to do something, we find excuses. And Moses said, they won't believe me, God. They won't believe me if I go back. They won't believe me that you are telling me to do this. You have to tell me your name. Tell me your name. Now that's a tall order for Old Testament stories. The name of God is secret. It's not known. There are many names for God, but they're not known. Tell me your name. And I think Moses was about to hear, at least expected to hear, God say, I can't tell you my name. We can't do that. We're all done here. Go back and take care of sheep. But that's not what God does. God says, I am. Notice the word order. I am who I am. Yahweh in Hebrew. I am who I am. I am comes from the verb to be. I am being. I am being itself. Tell the people, I am has sent you. This is my name forever. To be. The question is this fake news? Now we know how that story turned out, right? Moses goes back to Egypt. Moses takes the people out of Egypt. And Passover gets to be a festival of the Jews and a festival for us as well. Passover means freedom. Freedom. Freedom from hostage-taking, freedom from Egypt, freedom from all those things that hold us back in this life. Fake news? Well, we know how that turned out. Jesus is walking on his way through the New Testament. And he, on his walk, he encounters a blind man, a man who is blind from birth. And he says to the man, come here. And he made spittle and soil into mud and put mud on the eyes of the blind man. And he told the blind man, now go down to Siloam, the pool of Siloam. How many of you have been to Israel? You know where Siloam is? At the end of Hezekiah's tunnel, right? Siloam means sent. And so he was sent down to the pool that means sent. And I suspect that Siloam comes from at least somebody's idea that the water was sent through Hezekiah's tunnel down into that pool that would be safe for a city that was under siege. People could get water in Siloam inside the city walls from the Hezekiah tunnel. The blind man came back, able to see. And the people that were around saying, "Is this the blind man we knew, who was blind from birth, who's never seen anything in his life, and now he sees?" Or some of the people said, "Is this fake news? Is this kind of a trick?" "Yes," they said, "you must be Jesus' disciple, and you're trying to trick us into doing something here with Jesus. We Jews are disciples of Moses. We know God spoke to Moses." Notice the interesting thing there? Nobody was sure that God spoke to Moses when Moses was out by that burning bush. Nobody was sure about his story. Now in the New Testament, we're sure that God spoke to Moses. But this man, this Jesus, has God truly spoken to him? The blind man said, "This is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opens my eyes." And they drove the blind man out. Who is this man who opens eyes? The Gospel of John is a wonderful gospel that starts the way Genesis starts. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's the way John starts, as if it's a repeat or a commentary on Genesis. And the end of John says, "These signs are written that you may come to believe that this Jesus is the Messiah." The whole of the Gospel of John is centered around understanding who Jesus is and how Jesus has come to God's people. What does Jesus say? Jesus said at one point in the Gospel of John, "I am." Where does the "I am" come from? Old Testament. "I am who I am," Yahweh. Jesus says, "I am the bread of life." We know what it's like to need food. The youth are planning their fast for this coming weekend. After 30 hours of not eating, they'll know what it means to have bread, to have food, unless they cheat. But, we don't expect too much of that. "I am the bread of life," Jesus says. Without food, you die. Jesus again says, "I am the light of the world." You can't see in darkness. When I was on my sabbatical in Ireland, I went to Newgrange in the Boyne Valley. Perhaps some of you have been to the Newgrange as well. It's a 5,000-year-old tomb where ceremonies were taken for the dead. It's designed in an amazingly engineered way. It's designed so that the tomb inside is in darkness most of the year. But as the sun comes up on the winter solstice, it comes down the tunnel entrance, and it would hit, at the time it was used over these thousands of years, it would hit a brass plate, polished brass plate, that would light up the whole thing. All the cavern, all of the thing would be lit up. When Judy and I visited there, they turned the lights out on us to show us what true darkness is. How many of you have been in true darkness? You can't see your hand in front of your face. My wife was holding onto my elbow, and they kept us in darkness long enough for my whole arm to go numb. She was squeezing it so hard in the darkness. She doesn't like not to be able to see. And then they turn the lights on, and they show you what would happen. We weren't there at the winter solstice. Only about 25 people get to do that every year. But they show you what it would be like for that light to come down and light up the whole place. I am the light of the world. People 5,000 years ago built this to know that indeed light comes into the world and it gives life. And in darkness, there is no light. There is no way. There is only fear, like my wife's fear of that darkness. Jesus says in the Gospel of John, I am the true vine. You know what vines do? They grow. We know that vines also connect. And as long as they're connected, they grow healthy and strong and fruitful. That's the church. The vine is the church. We're connected through the church. We're connected not only in this generation, but in all the generations of the church. We're connected the whole way back. Soon we'll celebrate Holy Communion. That also connects us in a sacramental way with all of the faithful in every generation. Jesus says, I am the true vine. And of course, in today's gospel, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd can also be translated as I am the beautiful shepherd. And the comparison, of course, is to a hired hand, one that runs away, one that sees a wolf coming and says, I'm out of here. Somebody else can worry about the sheep, and the sheep are scattered or eaten. It's because he doesn't care. The beautiful shepherd, the good shepherd, cares for the sheep. I have other sheep, not in this fold, the Gospel of John says, so that we might be able to be gathered into one flock with one shepherd. They will know my voice. They will call my name. They will know what's going on. And of course, then I will lay down my life for the sheep. We understand what the early church understood, what John understood. Jesus was about to lay down a life for the sheep. And in still another place in the Gospel of John, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. The way, of course, is a name for the early church followers. People in the early church following Jesus were called followers of the way. I am the way. I am truth. This is not fake news, guys. That's what John is saying. This is not fake news. There were plenty of people, Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes and Zealots, who doubted that this Jesus was the Messiah, but this is the truth. I am the truth, the living truth. Yahweh's living truth. And I am the life, the wisdom to decipher in this life what is true and what is not, what is fake and what is good news. We as God's people read the gospel. We stand for the gospel. We memorize parts of the gospel. Some of us know more parts than others, but we all memorize parts of the gospel in the church. But the gospel comes alive when we live it as the good news. Martin Luther, whose hometowns and whose various places we'll visit in the fall, Martin Luther came to believe with all of his heart that the fake news in his era was the medieval trust in paper, promises, and threats. He was threatened, and his papers were to be destroyed, and he was called before even the emperor and told, recant, take it all back. Martin Luther, having been convinced with all of his heart in the truth of this message of the gospel, said, I cannot recant. I cannot recant my words. Here I stand. I can do no other. He knew this. He learned this. He studied this because of Romans, where he read, Paul said, the one who is righteous will live by faith. And for him, that was the really good news. What he centered on, Luther centered on righteous, right with God. He had always been wondering, how do I get right with God? How much work do I have to do to get right with God? And now he finds out that this is a gift of faith. Those who are right with God are those who have been called with the gift of faith. The gospel we trust as God's good news tells us about God's grace, that God's grace abounds to free us, like Moses, to learn wisdom through our Lord Jesus Christ. Here I stand, I can do no other. Here I stand, I can do no other. You're not standing. Come on.